The first time I heard my sister's voice on the other end of the phone, there was something wrong in the way she spoke. I didn't catch it immediately, but looking back, I should have. She told me about a trail she had found on the outskirts of a national park, an obscure, little-known path she wanted to hike alone. She said it was quieter, more peaceful than the crowded routes we usually took. Something about the sound of her voice, though, made me uneasy, like she was trying to convince me it was a good idea, even though I knew it wasn't. "You'll be fine," I told her. "Just stick to the main trails." But she insisted on this one. Said she needed the solitude, that it was the perfect escape. She'd been feeling overwhelmed, I could tell, and I didn't want to argue, so I let her go. She promised to call when she got back to the car, but the call never came. The next morning, I got a message from her, but it wasn't what I expected. It was short and cryptic. "I think I've made a mistake. Something's off. Can you come?" That was the moment I knew something had gone terribly wrong. I immediately headed out to find her, hoping it wasn't as bad as it seemed. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The whole drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling me toward the trail she had been on, as if the world itself had shifted, pulling at the threads of reality. When I arrived at the park entrance, I was told by a ranger that the trail my sister had mentioned didn't exist. At least, it wasn't on their official maps. There were no records of any trail fitting the description she had given me. I tried to press the ranger, showing him her last message and asking for help, but he just looked at me blankly, almost apologetically, and said, "It's not on the maps, but sometimes people get confused. There are a lot of hidden paths." I didn't have time to argue. I set off into the park, retracing her steps based on the vague directions she had sent me before the message. It didn't take long before I started to feel the strange atmosphere that had haunted her last text. The forest seemed to close in on me, the trees thick and gnarled, casting shadows that stretched farther than they should. The further I walked, the more the air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I checked my phone again, but the signal was gone. No GPS, no way of knowing where I was. I kept moving forward, trusting my instincts to guide me, but the deeper I went, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trail ahead became indistinct, less like a path and more like the forest itself had swallowed it. Branches seemed to claw at me as I passed, and I could have sworn I saw shadows darting between the trees, watching me, but when I turned to look, they were gone. I finally reached what looked like a clearing, a wide, open space surrounded by tall, twisted trees. It was unnaturally quiet here. No birds, no rustling of leaves. Just silence. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a trail marker, an old wooden post with faded lettering. The lettering was illegible now, as if it had been weathered by years, or decades. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed the wood, a chill ran through my entire body. A voice echoed in my mind, faint and distant, my sister's voice, calling out to me, her words distorted and warped. "Help me find me!" The fear hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned around, desperate to find my way back, but the forest had changed again. The path I'd just walked down was no longer there. The trees that had once stood in a neat row had rearranged themselves, forming an endless wall of dark silhouettes. I was trapped. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest only seemed to grow thicker and more disorienting. Hours passed, or maybe days. It was hard to tell with the way time warped in this place. Every direction I tried led me deeper into the unknown, into the heart of something that wasn't natural. I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of crunching leaves, twigs snapping. I turned around, expecting to see another hiker, but there was no one. Just the deepening shadow of the trees and the creeping fog that had begun to roll in, thick and suffocating. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me!" It was my sister. But her voice was different now, strained, like she was being pulled further away with each breath. I ran towards the sound, desperate, shouting her name. I could feel the earth beneath me shift, the very ground itself pulling at my feet. The path ahead of me twisted and forked in ways that didn't make sense, like I was walking in a dream where logic no longer applied. And then I saw her. She was standing in the distance, her back to me. The same silhouette I'd recognized, but this wasn't my sister anymore. Her posture was wrong, too rigid, too stiff. I called out to her, my voice desperate, but she didn't turn. Her body trembled as if caught in some invisible force. I rushed toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached out to touch her shoulder, she turned around. Her face was wrong. It wasn't my sister anymore. The features were the same, but her eyes, they were dark, like voids that swallowed the light around them. Her mouth twisted into an unnerving smile, one that was too wide, too sharp. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice low and distorted. And that's when I realized. She wasn't lost in the forest. The forest had taken her. The ground beneath me trembled, the trees creaking as if they were alive, shifting around me. The fog thickened, closing in on my vision, and I felt myself being pulled, not just physically but mentally, dragged deeper into the dark heart of the forest. I fought to escape, to find the way out, but every step I took led me further away from the world I knew. My sister was still out there, somewhere, a shadow among the trees, her voice calling to me, urging me to follow. But I couldn't. I couldn't let this place pull me any deeper. I ran blindly until I stumbled out of the woods, breathless and terrified. But when I looked back, the trail that didn't exist, was gone. The trees stood tall and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I've tried to return, to find the path again, but it never appears when I need it. It's like the forest doesn't want me to find it. I don't know where my sister is. I don't know if she's still out there, lost to a place that doesn't exist. But I know this much, the forest is waiting. And it will always be waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander too far. There's a trail near our town that runs deep into the woods, winding around hills and passing through dense trees, leading to a small clearing by the river. It's a place many of us used to hike as kids, but none of us go there anymore, not after dark. Every night, without fail, someone walks that trail. I've heard the stories, rumors that get passed around like they're nothing but urban legends. But they're not. I know better. It started a few months ago when my friend Mark told me about it. We'd been hanging out at the local diner after work when he mentioned hearing screams late one night, the kind of scream you'd expect from someone in real pain, desperate for help. "I heard it too," I said, not wanting to sound like I didn't believe him, but I was skeptical. Mark always had a flair for drama, but something in his voice made me second guess. "What happened?" "Well," he said, lowering his voice, like the mere mention of it made the room darker. "I went out to the trail to check it out. I didn't want to be the one to just ignore it, you know." "What did you find?" I asked, leaning forward. "Nothing. I waited there for hours, but it was just silence. No one. But the next night, it happened again. Another scream, just as loud. That night, I decided I would check it out myself. I'd never been one to shy away from things like that, and besides, it was just a noise. A person in trouble, sure, but why couldn't they just call for help? The next evening, I drove out to the edge of town, where the trailhead begins. It was late, well after sunset. The air was thick with fog, and the moon hung like a pale lantern in the sky. As I parked my truck, I noticed the hair on the back of my neck standing up, but I shook it off. It was just nerves. I stood at the start of the trail for a long time, listening. The sounds of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind were all that greeted me. It felt peaceful at first, but I couldn't shake the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. Then, just as I was about to turn around, I heard it. A scream. It cut through the night air like a blade, sharp and frantic. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. The scream was followed by frantic shouting, desperate calls for help, as if someone was begging for their life. "Help! Please! Someone please help! I felt a chill run through me, but I was already moving, taking steps toward the sound, my feet crunching against the dry leaves. The screaming continued, the panic and the voice unmistakable. I had to help. I had to. I pushed forward, the sound of my boots on the path the only thing louder than the screams. But then something strange happened. The screams started to fade. Just like that. As if the person had been pulled away from me. Hey! I called out, hoping someone would hear me. But there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the woods. I stood there for a long time, listening, trying to make sense of it. But I knew deep down something wasn't right. It wasn't just a lost hiker or some prankster. There was something more to it. Something sinister. I left the trail that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I met with Mark again. You went out there? He asked, his face serious. I did, I said. I heard the screams, but when I went looking, there was nothing. I think it was. I don't know. I don't think it was real. Not in the way we think. Mark nodded, as if he already knew that. Yeah. That's how it is. It always happens at night. Different person. Same scream. I stared at him, confused. What do you mean? You said it happened the other night. You think someone's out there for real? Let me show you something, Mark said, pulling his phone out of his pocket. He scrolled for a minute before showing me a video. The picture was grainy dark, but I could make out a person in the distance, walking along the trail. It was the trail. And the person was yelling for help. Where did you get this? I asked, my voice shaky. I heard the scream last week, and I went out there. Same thing. I found someone on the trail, yelling for help. But just like you, when I got closer they disappeared. I didn't know what to do, so I just filmed it. I felt a wave of dread hit me. You didn't try to help them? I couldn't, Mark said quietly. You're not supposed to. What do you mean, not supposed to? There's a rule. The people on the trail, they aren't really there. You can't help them. No one can. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. That's insane. What are you talking about? Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Look, I don't know who started it, but for as long as I can remember, it's been like this. Every night, someone walks the trail and screams for help. But if you try to help them, you disappear too. The trail, it has its own rules. And we don't get to break them. I felt the weight of his words settle in. What happens if you don't help? Nothing, Mark said. But if you try, if you get too close, you're lost. Like them. No one talks about it, but it happens. I sat back, trying to wrap my mind around it. I wanted to deny it, to pretend like we were just talking about a prank or a weird coincidence. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Those screams weren't just random. They were a warning. A curse. Something dark. And yet, every night someone else would go out there. I didn't go back to the trail after that night. Mark didn't either. We told people about the scream, but no one believed us, not really. It became one of those things people joked about, something to tell the new people who moved into town. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a joke. Every night, I would hear it again, the scream for help, echoing through the trees. But I couldn't help. No one could. And every night, someone new would walk the trail, only to be swallowed by it. The morning was crisp, the kind of early autumn chill that makes you pull your jacket tight around your shoulders, even as the sun tries to warm the earth. I was out on one of my usual hikes, a long trek through a lesser-known trail that wound its way up a ridge, deep into the dense woods. The kind of place most people avoid, where silence is broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves disturbed by a passing animal. I'd been a park ranger long enough to know when something was off. This trail, especially, had a history. People wandered into these woods, thinking they could handle the isolation, but they didn't always make it back. I wasn't concerned for myself. I'd seen it all, from lost hikers to bizarre wildlife encounters. But there was always a sense of vigilance that you couldn't shake. As I hiked up the familiar path, the sound of my boots crunching over the dry earth was the only noise I could hear. The trees around me were beginning to lose their leaves, their once vibrant greens shifting into shades of amber and gold. The serenity of it all felt like a sharp contrast to the heavy silence that had begun to weigh on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The trail took a steep incline, leading me into a dense thicket of pines, their boughs heavy with mist. It was in this section of the hike where I found him. I saw him first from a distance. A man, standing at the edge of the trail, swaying slightly. His backpack hung loosely from his shoulders, and he wasn't facing me. He was staring off into the trees, as if he'd heard something I couldn't. I immediately assessed the situation. A lost hiker, likely disoriented and probably in need of help. But as I approached, something in my gut twisted with unease. There was an unfamiliar presence about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Hey, you alright?" I called out, my voice cutting through the quiet of the forest. He didn't respond at first. His head jerked towards me slowly, and his eyes, wide and glazed over, locked onto mine. He blinked a few times, as if trying to refocus, before a slow smile spread across his face. I think I'm lost," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, as if the forest itself might be listening. "Can't find my way back." I approached him cautiously, my instincts telling me to be careful. The air felt heavier, charged in a way that made me hyper-aware of every rustle in the trees around us. I took a few more steps, but something wasn't right. I'd been trained to recognize when a person is disoriented or in distress, but this man, he wasn't just lost. His demeanor was unsettlingly calm, like someone who had been out there too long, or worse, someone who didn't want to leave. "You've been out here for a while?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "What's your name?" His smile never wavered, though his eyes darted to something behind me, off to my left. The hairs on my neck prickled. I followed his gaze, expecting to see some wildlife, maybe a deer or a bear, but there was nothing. Just more trees. "Name's Ben," he said, his voice now lower, almost blending with the rustling of the wind through the trees. "I've been here longer than I should have been, but it's not me you should worry about." I froze. The hairs on my arms rose. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, a shift in the air made my heart skip a beat. The forest, which had been eerily still, seemed to hold its breath. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, long and thin, moving between the trees, just beyond the edge of the trail. I snapped my gaze back to Ben, but he was staring at it too, his body tense. He didn't seem alarmed. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. As if whatever was out there was something he'd been expecting. "Do you see it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "It's always with me. Watching, waiting." The fear crept up my spine as I glanced over at him, struggling to make sense of his words. Was he hallucinating? Was this a psychological break brought on by dehydration or exhaustion? "I don't see anything," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though my instincts were screaming at me to run. Ben let out a slow, shaky breath. "It's always there. No matter where I go, it follows. But it's not something you can see. Not unless it wants you to." The forest seemed to close in around us, the silence growing suffocating. I took a step back, my mind racing through the possibilities. Could there be some sort of animal stalking him? Or was it something else, something unnatural? I wasn't sure, but something told me I didn't want to stay to find out. "Ben," I said, my voice firm now, "you're coming with me. Let's get you out of here." He nodded slowly, but there was something in his eyes, a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "You don't have to worry about me. You'll see it too soon enough. It's already watching you." I took another step back, unwilling to take any chances. It wasn't just the man who made me uneasy, it was the sense of being observed. As if the trees themselves were shifting, not by wind, but by something deliberate. I turned my back to Ben, signaling for him to follow me. He didn't move at first, but then he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Behind me, the shadow and the trees moved again. And this time, I could feel it, cold, like a presence, hovering just beyond my vision, watching me. I glanced over my shoulder to check on Ben. He was still there, but his expression had changed. It was no longer the calm, serene look he'd had before. His eyes were wide, frantic now, and his mouth moved in a whisper I couldn't hear. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I glanced around, every sense on high alert. But when I looked back at Ben, he was gone. Panic surged through me as I spun in a circle, scanning the trees, calling his name. Ben! Ben! But there was no response. Just the silence of the forest, deeper now, more profound. I was alone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to calm myself, but the sensation of being watched was too overwhelming. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. With a final glance at the now emptied trail, I turned and began running back down the path, my legs moving faster than they ever had before, my heart racing in my chest. And even as I sprinted away from the place where I'd last seen Ben, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something that had followed me from the moment I saw the lost man on the trail. Something that was still watching. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just a man I had found that day. It was something else, something far worse. It was one of those rare summer weekends when all of us managed to sync our schedules and head out for a hike. I had always been one for the outdoors, and the mountains of Kentucky were as familiar to me as the back of my hand. This time, though, the trail we chose was different, nestled deeper into the foothills where the land seemed untouched and untouched by time. A perfect escape from the everyday. There were 5 of us, me, Jason, Emily, Tabitha, and Mike. We were all friends from college, and our plan was to camp for the weekend. We had all been on hikes before, but this one felt different. The moment we stepped off the well-worn trail into the more secluded path, a quiet hung in the air, almost like the forest was holding its breath. The path was overgrown, the dense trees leaning in, as if trying to keep us from going any further. We laughed it off, thinking it added to the adventure. But something in the back of my mind made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the sunlight barely filtered through the canopy, casting shadows on the ground like dark, creeping fingers. We set up camp after a couple of hours of hiking. The clearing was small but beautiful. The fire crackled as we set our tents up, the smell of pine and fresh earth mixing with the smoke of the fire. We ate, drank, and joked, the noise of the forest around us slowly fading into the background as we focused on our small circle. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a pale orange light over the camp, something had changed. It wasn't obvious at first, but I started to notice it, the quietness. The usual sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, had all but vanished. Even the wind had stopped. It was like the forest had decided to freeze in time. I shook it off, trying to enjoy the evening, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Tabitha, who had been sitting near the edge of the firelight, had disappeared. "Where's Tabitha?" I asked, trying to peer into the darkness of the trees beyond the firelight. Jason looked around too. "She was right here a second ago." We all stood, scanning the surrounding forest, calling her name. But there was no answer, not even an echo of her voice. We searched for what felt like hours, the darkness closing in around us. It wasn't like her to wander off without saying anything. "She probably went to take a walk, guys. She's done that before," Emily said, trying to ease the growing tension. But even as she spoke, a cold feeling crept into my chest, something I couldn't explain. It was the kind of feeling you'd get when you know something isn't right but can't put your finger on it. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, taking turns watching the camp. The fire flickered weakly as the hours dragged on, and we tried not to let the silence of the forest freak us out too much. Then, just before dawn, Tabitha returned. She stepped out of the woods like she had just woken up from a nap, but something about her was off. Her clothes were torn, and her hair was matted with dirt and leaves. "Tabitha!" Mike shouted, rushing over to her. "Where have you been?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at us with a blank expression, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Are you okay?" I asked, walking up to her cautiously. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, there was a sharp, metallic taste in the air, a lingering tang that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. The silence was deafening, and all I could hear was the rustling of leaves underfoot, as if the forest itself was breathing with us. Tabitha finally spoke, but her voice wasn't her own. It was flat, hollow, as if something else had taken over her. "I'm not the same," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Something about her words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We tried to comfort her, but there was no warmth in her eyes, no recognition. It was like she wasn't really there. We didn't know what to do. It felt like everything was spiraling out of control. Mike and Jason wanted to go back to the car, but Emily and I were hesitant. There was something about the woods that felt wrong, like it had taken Tabitha and was now trying to take the rest of us. After hours of arguing, we finally decided to pack up and leave. But as we were breaking down the tents, Mike went missing. We searched for him, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Just the same empty, eerie quiet that had descended upon the camp when Tabitha had disappeared earlier. Emily and I were frantic now. Tabitha, who had been standing by the fire just moments before, was now gone too. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The woods had swallowed them up, just like it had with Tabitha the night before. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. Emily and I were alone in the woods. We tried to leave, but the trees seemed to close in around us, the path we had walked on earlier now completely obscured. It wasn't until the third day that I saw it. I was walking ahead of Emily, my nerves on edge, when I heard something in the distance, a low growl that rumbled through the trees. I turned to Emily, but she wasn't there. I called her name, my voice trembling, but there was no answer. Then I saw it. Just beyond the trees, in the dim light of the setting sun, stood a figure. It was tall, its head unnaturally large, its arms too long. It was like a distorted version of a person, its body stretched and contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The taste of metal was in the air again, thick and suffocating, and I felt my stomach churn. I didn't know what this thing was, but I knew it wasn't human. I ran, stumbling through the dense underbrush, calling for Emily. The figure followed me, its silhouette flickering in and out of sight, always just behind the trees, never fully revealed. I don't know how I made it out. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, I turned back to see if Emily was behind me. But she never came. It took me days to find my way back to civilization. I don't know how I did it, but I somehow stumbled upon a road and flagged down a passing car. They took me to the nearest town, where I reported what had happened, but when the search teams went into the woods, they found nothing. No sign of Emily, no trace of Mike, no sign of the creature. I couldn't help but think back on all those warnings my Grams had given me, warnings I thought were just superstitions. Now I'm not so sure. There's something in those woods, something that shouldn't be, something that waits for those who wander too far. And I've learned the hard way that when you step into the hollow, you might not come back out. The woods have always been my refuge. I grew up with towering trees as my companions, their whispers in the wind a kind of solace when the chaos of life got too loud. Hiking alone had never been a cause for concern. I was cautious, carrying a sturdy knife, a whistle, and a fully charged phone. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I met my stalker, and why I'll never forget them. It started like any other hike. The late autumn air was crisp, tinged with the scent of decaying leaves. The trail I chose led to a deep, secluded part of the forest, far from the more frequented paths. It was my escape, my secret pocket of solitude. By the time I parked my car and hit the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low, casting a golden haze over the world. I had a couple of hours before sunset, plenty of time to reach the old creek and loop back. Or so I thought. About a mile into the hike, I noticed something odd. The usual forest sounds, birds chirping, squirrels rustling through the underbrush, had dimmed. It wasn't silence, exactly, but a tension in the air, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I chalked it up to overthinking. Maybe the oncoming dusk was playing tricks on me. But when I paused to adjust my pack, I caught it, the faintest crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steady but wary. No answer. Just the whisper of the wind through the trees. Shaking it off, I resumed my hike, quickening my pace. Yet, the uneasy feeling clung to me, a prickle at the back of my neck that refused to fade. The trail narrowed as it twisted deeper into the woods, the canopy thickening overhead. By the time I reached the creek, the sun was barely a sliver on the horizon. I paused to drink from my water bottle, scanning the area. That's when I saw it, a shadow shifting among the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but the movement was deliberate, purposeful. Someone was there. Watching me. I called out again, louder this time. "Is someone there?" Still no reply. But the shadow remained, a dark blot against the golden light filtering through the branches. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone, and whoever it was didn't want to be seen. Dusk settled fast, and I knew I needed to head back. The return hike felt infinitely longer, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves amplified in the growing darkness. The shadow, my stalker, didn't stay hidden. They followed me, always just far enough away that I couldn't make out their features. Once or twice, I thought I heard breathing, low and heavy, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to stay calm, rationalizing the situation. Maybe it was another hiker who didn't want to startle me. Maybe it was some lost teenager unsure how to approach a stranger. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. This was intentional. I was about half a mile from the trailhead when I heard the footsteps behind me quicken. They weren't trying to stay hidden anymore. Panic surged, and I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the dirt path. The footsteps matched my pace, closing the distance. I've never felt fear like that, primal, all-consuming. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran, the weight of my pack slowing me down. The trailhead was so close, but it felt impossibly far. And then I tripped. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the air knocked from my lungs. Scrambling to my feet, I turned to face whatever was behind me, clutching my knife with shaking hands. But there was no one there. I didn't waste time questioning my luck. Stumbling forward, I finally reached the parking lot, collapsing against my car. Relief washed over me as I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped them. That's when I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the trail, just where the trees began. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows. Something about the way he stood, motionless, watching, made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and peeling out of there as fast as I could. It wasn't until later that night, safe in my apartment, that I realized the full extent of what had happened. While washing up, I noticed scratches on the back of my pack, as if something sharp had grazed it. My mind flashed back to the shadow, the footsteps, the man in the clearing. He hadn't just been following me. He'd gotten close enough to touch me. But here's the thing, as unsettling as the encounter was, I can't shake the feeling that he saved me. The scratches on my pack weren't random. They were deep and deliberate, the kind an animal, a large one, might leave. Looking back, I remember the strange silence in the woods, the way the birds had stopped singing. Something had been out there with me, something more dangerous than any man. And whoever my stalker was, they kept it at bay. Maybe he scared it off. Maybe his presence alone was enough to protect me. I don't know. What I do know is that without him, I might not have made it out of those woods alive. I've been back to that trail since, though never alone. I've tried to make sense of what happened, scouring forums and talking to locals. Some say it was a cougar or a bear. Others hint at something more supernatural, stories of spirits and guardians of the forest. But none of that feels quite right. Whoever he was, my stalker didn't just follow me. He stayed with me, shadowed me until I was safe. And while the memory of that night still haunts me, I can't bring myself to hate him. If anything, I'm grateful. Because sometimes, the scariest things in the woods aren't the ones you can see. It was a foggy winter morning, the kind where the world feels muffled and far away, wrapped in a heavy, suffocating blanket of mist. I'd just finished my first night shift as a park ranger and was looking forward to a few hours of peace and quiet on my usual patrol. The fog clung to the trees like damp, ghostly hands, making the trail seem even more isolated than usual. The air was sharp, biting, but I hardly noticed. It was the kind of chill I'd grown used to after spending so many years working in the Cascades. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots was the only sound that accompanied me as I trekked deeper into the wilderness. It was oddly soothing, the solitude. The calls of birds, distant and faint, created an almost serene atmosphere, with the fog muting the rest of the world. I had my thoughts to myself, my mind wandering between the long shift I'd just endured and the cold, lonely landscape ahead. But then, in the midst of the stillness, I heard it. A faint cry. Soft, sorrowful, almost pitiful. I paused, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I wasn't sure if it was real at first, maybe just the wind playing tricks with my tired senses, or perhaps an animal in distress. A fox, maybe, or a deer. But no, this was different. This was the unmistakable sound of a child. My heart sank, a knot of unease tightening in my chest. The fog was so thick now that the trail ahead seemed to disappear into nothingness. I squinted, trying to peer through the haze. And then I saw him. A small figure, standing motionless in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought I was seeing things, maybe a trick of the fog, but no, there he was, a boy, no older than 6 or 7, wearing a ragged coat that barely reached his knees. His hair, dark and matted, hung in tangled strands around his face. He was clutching something in his hands. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, but as I approached, I saw it was a stuffed animal, worn and frayed, its threadbare fur barely holding together. The boy was crying, but his sobs were almost too quiet to hear clearly, like he was trying not to be heard, or perhaps too weak to cry out louder. His face was pale, ghostly almost, and his eyes were wide, vacant, as if he wasn't even fully aware of the world around him. My first instinct should have been to turn back, to follow my gut that screamed something was wrong. But I didn't. Instead, I felt a strange compulsion, something that pulled me closer, against every rational thought in my head. He was just a child, alone in the wilderness, and he needed help. Didn't he? Hey there! I called out softly, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. Are you okay? The boy didn't respond. His cries were softer now, more pitiful, but still, he didn't move. It wasn't until I took a few cautious steps forward that he finally looked up at me. And when he did, I froze. His eyes weren't the innocent, fearful eyes of a lost child. No. They were empty, hollow. They seemed to stare right through me, as if he didn't even see me standing there. His lips trembled, and he looked down at the stuffed animal in his hands before back up at me. Help me! He whispered, his voice barely audible, carried away almost immediately by the mist. I should have known better. Every bone in my body was telling me to step away, to leave him there and report it later. But something about his voice, so fragile, so full of desperation, kept me rooted to the spot. I'm here to help. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The boy didn't move. Instead, he simply pointed deeper into the fog, down the trail that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Please come with me. I hesitated. The trail was dangerous this time of year. The fog could easily disorient you, especially for someone so small. But then again, he was alone, and I was the ranger, trained to handle situations like this. Where are your parents? I asked gently, my concern deepening. Where did you come from? But he didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned and began walking down the path, his small feet barely making a sound. His pace was slow, dragging, as if he were weighed down by some invisible burden. I glanced around, trying to shake the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. The fog had thickened so much that I could barely see my own hand in front of me. The world had become an eerie, indistinct blur. The boy led me further into the trail, his footsteps quiet, but the cries seemed to grow louder with every step, now unmistakable in their sorrow. My breath grew heavier, each exhale visible in the cold air. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the boy's occasional sobs and the steady crunch of my boots on the frost-covered ground. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the fog thickening around us, swallowing the trail. The world outside this strange bubble of fog and sorrow ceased to exist. Eventually, I stopped, my hand trembling as I placed it on the boy's shoulder. Where are we going? I asked, my voice shaking now. The unsettling sense of being led into something I didn't understand pressed down on me. The boy didn't answer. He just turned his head slightly, his hollow eyes locking onto mine once again. There was something in his gaze, something dark, as if he were trying to convey something I couldn't quite grasp. Something that chilled me to my core. Without warning, he let go of the stuffed animal and took a few steps toward a shadowed area in the trees. I followed, my heart pounding now, my instincts screaming for me to turn back, but I couldn't. Not when the boy needed help. He stopped beside a large tree, its gnarled roots exposed above the ground like twisted fingers clawing at the earth. The air grew colder, heavier, and the cries, they were no longer faint. They echoed around me, coming from every direction, as if the very forest itself were crying. Do you hear them? The boy whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. I looked around, my skin crawling. The cries were no longer just the boy's. They were everywhere. In the wind. In the trees. In the ground beneath my feet. Who are they? I stammered, my voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. The boy turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression, a twisted, malicious grin that didn't belong on the face of a child. You shouldn't have followed me, he whispered. You shouldn't have come here. Before I could react, the world seemed to collapse in on itself. The cries grew deafening, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The tree beside me groaned, its branches creaking as if alive. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The boy, he was gone. Disappeared. But the cries remained. Louder. Closer. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, the fog pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. And somewhere behind me, I heard the boy's voice, still echoing through the fog. You shouldn't have followed me.